is this is existentialism, psychoanalysis, and anti-psychiatry. I think our sixth section, and yeah, we're discussing Sartre's bad faith. So maybe I could ask you any thoughts about this. I was going to begin with a kind of a teleological reading, the end point on the censor, what he does with the censor. And this has been a point of a lot of contention within both philosophy and in psychoanalysis. Of course, Sartre is in denial, if we use sort of psychoanalytic language, of the science of the unconscious, that psychoanalysis is that. He will engage with the question of childhood, the family romance, all of these things he'll accept as possibilities, and obviously this plays out in the book on Flaubert, the idiot of the family. He spends, as I've mentioned, 800 pages on Genesis and Constitution of Flaubert and his childhood. So this is again Sartre, really going through descriptive phenomenology, to the maximum. So anyway, but any thoughts about this? I mean, we've read at least the section on bad faith, and again, I'm very interested in bad faith politically, and in also in relationships together, and in both regards, in concrete relations with other, which I think is a chapter. We're not reading it here, but if you have the text, certainly worth reading, and then of course the project later on existential psychoanalysis, and one looks at freedom as spontaneity at the base, right? Again, his argument is against a kind of, if you will, Sartre writes being in nothingness, and at one level, one intention is to criticize this very mediocre French psychoanalytic scene, which he considered much too orthodox and much too reductive, in this way. I don't think there was ever really actual discussions with Lacan. Obviously, the gaze, and the regard, the look and the gaze were taken up later by Lacan, in his own writings, and Sartre is mentioned. I don't know how many times, to my knowledge, Sartre did not really engage Lacanian psychoanalysis head on. He knew many people in the movement. Paris is a very kind of insular academic and intellectual scene, so they all knew each other. But at the same time, I don't think Sartre ever got into the debates. Yeah. So, yeah. One person did mention, and this is kind of interesting, that May of 68 was Sartrean freedom and its spontaneity, that was the manifestation that happened in May 68. Going to start. Yeah. Yeah. And at the same time, when they tried to put Sartre in jail, de Gaulle issued the edict, you cannot put Voltaire in jail, which is quite a compliment, right? In a sense, really, really interesting. So yeah, it was hands off. Sorry. Yeah, Patrick. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about how it played in different countries. I mean, what was the influence? I mean, Sartre obviously influenced Lacan.
Yes.
At least I see that in terms of like the notion of enunciation,
Yes.
in terms of
Enunciation and the regard, the look that for
yeah,
Lacan
the
became
gaze.
gaze.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Please. Yeah.
But in England, I mean, R.D. Laing obviously, and in the United States, there were people who were Rollo May, etc.
Yes.
In some, but I wonder what was the difference in the different countries in terms of the influence of what went on with this? Because this, I Sartre is a kind of blank in my education. I hate to
Okay.
confess that,
Okay.
but this is good, interesting stuff in terms of
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So
And I think closer to, your work, which we're looking forward to looking at sometime in the fall on Lorenzer, if you want to
mhm.
translation. I mean, I think Sartre is closer to some of the German movements in psychiatry and in psychoanalysis and in some of these things too, because of the social element, because Sartre was very much about the Mitwelt in Heideggerian sense, the social world, or the being with was always
Yeah.
a presupposition. Going back to the reception, the question you asked, I mean, there are multiple levels to this. Yes, obviously the Tavistock crew, Cooper and Lang, were very much taken by this, right? And uh, and you're right, there was a tremendous influence in the anti-psychiatry movement, and we'll go over that later. Of course, The Divided Self, right, and Self and Others are books extremely influenced by Being and Nothingness in many ways, and Lang was very much involved there. Also, Lang phenomenologically always thought it was very important to enter the patient's world, right? So this was a moment you somehow would enter the patient's world as best as possible instead of a distantiated, determined, if you will, approach that already has codes or constructs in a way. This is part of the attack on psychoanalysis was because of the construct, right, that was being imposed. The Oedipus construct, if you will, complexes, etc. So, yes, the United States, he had tremendous influence among some of the philosophers. Probably the best book of the working class appropriations was Ronald Aronson's book, Philosophy in the World, right? Aronson was a philosopher, working class philosopher, very militant Marxist who lived in Detroit and worked with Drum and many of the militant stuff. So he had tremendous influence on Aronson. And Aronson, unfortunately, I haven't been able to get the entire book, The Imagination, the Rutledge retranslation, but Aronson writes the introduction, by the way, alongside Sartre's adopted daughter. So Latin America taken up very actively. Remember, this is someone too, and I have great admiration for this because this is the anti-academic philosopher. This is the anti-armchair Marxist. Sartre visited Cuba. He met with Fidel. He, he,
Mhm.
he went on boats with Che, right? He went to Vietnam. He met with Ho Chi Minh. So these are people he and Dubois, really traveled in many ways and were philosophy in the world, I'll say, in a sense. So the influence was huge this way too. So this was an internationally recognition. In terms of appropriation at schools of existential psychoanalysis, I don't really know of many, right, in a way. I mean, there seem to be two dangerous moments that happened in against the Freudian, moment. The Reichian school, right, that ended up in the United States, the Mary Higgins thing, and that Reich was very dangerous to the Freudian movement. He broke. And then, secondly, of all, of course, the Sartrean movement, which really brought back the patient's choice, right? In a sense, the patient's choice and responsibility in that. And clinically speaking, if I can just mention again, Joel Covell's book, Age of
Yeah,
Desire,
yeah,
has
yeah.
a lot of good psychoanalytic hyphen existential psychoanalytic case studies. He has case studies, and
Hmm.
it's a very interesting approach to a kind of Sartrean way of doing therapy. And I've also mentioned Irving Yalom, whose book really was taken up actively in the early late 80s, middle 80s, excuse me, until the middle 90s. Yalom being someone who was famous for group psychotherapy. He was at Johns Hopkins for a while. He ended up at Stanford. He wrote a book on Spinoza, a book on Nietzsche, When Nietzsche Weeps, a book on Spinoza's life too. So he's very much in this moment of intellectual endeavors as well as being in my estimation a very good therapist. In terms of academic approaches, the phenomenological psychology part of school at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh is the place where this has been studied actively, right? In a way, it is part of their psychology PhD program, right? So there is this phenomenological psychology that goes on at Duquesne. If I was going to become a therapist and I wanted to get a very good background both in Freud and in existential psychoanalysis and the phenomenological method, I would go to Duquesne University from what I know of these departments over the years. Also, they do a 1 year reading of Capital from a phenomenological point of view, too. The only place I know where the philosophy department actually engages Marx. So to leave it to the Catholics, right? In some ways. So I don't know if that helped, but the Critique of Dialectical Reason was read by the Latin American and revolutionaries very, very actively. The Critique of Dialectical Reason, which we read, especially the notion of the group's infusion, right, and the spontaneity in the group's infusion. So for me, what's really interesting here is this notion of spontaneity. I was reading to Josh. I just wrote a little bit of what he did with jazz. Let me see what I found it. I just made a couple of notes to myself. I was listening to some very good stuff today. Again, Hassan Ali and others, this afternoon. Jazz is an auditory embodiment of existential freedom, right? Jazz demands that the listener engage in the present moment. There's nothing like, this kind of now time that is there, right? And nothing trapping, rather than relying on predetermined structures. So it's a kind of profound, very deep, and at the same time visceral realization and hearing. And I think this, in some ways, sums up Sartre's appeal, if you will, to a kind of some of the Americans too. But yes, the Latin American revolutionaries took up this very much, especially the practico inert, which we discussed at length, if you remember, on where the left is. See, for me, the bad faith is a political concept. I really think it's a political concept. I think, yes, it happens in our relations in everyday life. It's part of the politics of the family, but really in terms of the politics of liberalism, it really is an extremely rich concept. Josh, you wanted to say something?
No, no, I'm just
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah. So anyway, so I mean that's kind of where again I'd like to begin. The emphasis here is not so much on desire, again, right? It's more, even though he's French, he knows desire, in a way. I mean, Leslie Barrel and other people here that read this section on the women in bad faith, supposedly, that he talked about, can certainly criticize that. At the same time, Sartre is, like I said, this is a cafe writer. This is some trying to observe what motivates human beings, right? And they had no belief in human nature. Consciousness is primary, really. So you have to think of it this way. It is not a question, and he has no ecological or philosophy of nature. This is a philosophy of consciousness, but not parch on, with all due respect, of the consciousness industry that goes out there. It's about the mind operating in terms of the cogito, the thinking, and the pre-reflective cogito, and how this is operating in the world and in relations with others. So I don't know if that helps, Patrick. I mean, this is again someone tremendously influential, again on the generation of the '60s, in my opinion. Marcuse, who wrote a critique of existentialism from the point of view, from a Marxist perspective, that it didn't take into account social relations and material conditions and the question of class so much, and well-founded critique. Later said that the Critique of Dialectical Reason was, a masterpiece, and he was always struck by the ability of Sartre to dialectically think. So again, yeah, this is important. And I think where we are right now, it's not good to say there's only these antagonisms between existential psychoanalysis and Lacanian or the return to Freud. I mean, I think both and would be a much more better approach without fusing them and confusing them, but to take the best of both as we move forward, right? In many ways, yeah, yeah. So yeah. So I mean, any again, this attack on liberalism. So for example, I'm in a meeting union. Very stupid of me to even go to these meetings, but I see the bad faith of the negotiating team because they do not think it's the right time to take a strike authorization vote. And of course, in my head, I'm going crazy because I'm saying, why would you go to a negotiating table telling the other side that you're not coming to the table with your chief weapon that you're authorized to strike by your membership? Yeah, and their argument back to me, oh, our membership's not ready. They might vote it down, etc. This is very pale to me because what
This is a result of recent election of the MTA in Massachusetts.
yes,
Exactly. And the ones who basically were in favor of the option of keeping strikes on the table won.
oh, that's good. Yeah,
Yeah. So
that's
it's,
healthy. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So this is bad faith by people that consider themselves union people going forward. And Sean mentioned our friend Randy Weingarten last week, who, in my opinion, is a disaster to educational unions. I think yeah. So again, I think this is very important to look at this politically, at least in our struggles, et cetera, et cetera. He also talks about, in some ways, identification and bad faith, how we label. And this is one thing that I really like about existentialism or the existential project, if you will. It really tries to take away that veneer of labeling and identification so easily, right? And this is something that's very interesting. This proposition, this maxim that existence precedes essence, right? That we always begin with the outstandingness, like in Binswanger, beginning with the dreaming as part of existence, not something only to be interpreted. Yeah, of course there's symbols in dreams. Of course you can do all kinds of interpretive models, but it is a part of life, a part of existence. And I think that this is another thing that is rich in Sartrean existentialism, if you will. Yeah. So I don't know. Again, I'd love to hear from you. I know David, you shared some stuff last week, et cetera. I mean, this obviously goes on in everyday corporate practice, everyday academia, et cetera. We live in a culture of bad faith, right? Completely.
I, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's the union stuff obviously is always interesting to think about. I've seen a lot of that at Rutgers and Montclair State a while ago as well. And the marketing world, I mean, the logic of marketing and the way marketing has become kind of dominant, I think is really interesting to think about through this lens. I wanted to say though, Michael, as we jump into to the text tonight and focusing on bad faith, if you could. Um, uh, or if we could maybe like step back the relationship between anguish and bad faith and the way that Sartre sets up the like right before the chapter on bad faith starts. It's like the 5 pages before that. Uh,
Yes. Okay.
on page
Sorry, I should have assigned that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, on page
Good
81,
point. Yeah. Okay.
he shifts from a long description of what anguish is.
Right.
That's like a bunch of pages of about anguish and freedom, and anguish being the experience of like choice and choices closing down as you make choices and that kind of stuff. And then those last 5 pages of that chapter, he switches from this long, very concrete description of what anguish is to bad faith as a flight from anguish.
Yes.
And then it's just those 5 pages kind of setting up bad faith in that framework. And I know last week as I struggle through this, like struggle to make the concept articulate sort of for myself, stepping back in the last week and looking at the way, grounding myself in the way he sets it up and reminding myself of how he kind of frames the concept to begin with was helpful. So I thought that might be.
Okay, no, very good. And maybe I can just mention to everybody, I have obviously the new translation. I'm using this. I can go get the old one. Maybe you can do the pages too, David, if you have the old edition. But as far as I can see, the condition of Agnes is my ignorance of the underlying psychological determinism that I am anxious for want of knowledge of the true and efficacious motives in the shadows of my unconscious that determine my action. We can only reply, and this is on, I don't know if she's using the other text 69, maybe. I'm not sure. This is on page 72 in the Richmond text, in the origin of negation, right? But it's very interesting here because we can reject by saying that in the first place, we have not regarded anguish as a proof of human freedom. The latter presented itself as the necessary condition of questioning. We want simply to show that there is a specific way of being conscious of freedom, and that this way of being conscious is anguish, right? And this is a crucial sentence. I repeat again. We simply wanted to show there's a specific way of being conscious of freedom, and this way of being conscious, right, is anguish. In other words, our aim was to establish anguish, right, in its essential struggle as a consciousness of freedom, right? Again. And remember, he is dealing at the level, and I mean, hopefully this helps this understanding more. This is about the phenomena of consciousness, of Bewusstsein in German, or conscience in French, right? This is a structure of consciousness. He's trying to break down the structures, destructurate it, make it open in this way. So you're dealing with many layers here of consciousness, right? It's not so simply correlative, right? In a sense. So he'll go through this. This is the reflective consciousness, being able to start to see this, if you will. We wanted to show specific ability to becoming conscious of freedom and the way consciousness is anguish. In other words, to establish anguish in its essential structure as a consciousness of freedom, right? This is what anguish is. That's why we're so afraid of freedom. This is why we're so afraid, at least in my opinion, of taking risks, because we're really, in the Sartrean terms, petrified, if you will, of being free. We can like free, we can turn on the ignition, go somewhere, we can get on a plane, go somewhere, we can go free to shop, we're free to do this, et cetera, the movement, all this kind of stuff. But he's really trying to, I think, again, show that really deeply here that this is a very difficult moment. It's a difficult, to put it in a kind of metaphor, difficult liberty. That's what liberty is. It's very difficile, yeah, in this regard, right? So now, from the point of view, the existence of psychological determinism, and again, this is against this language, at least to me, is an attack on Freudian psychoanalysis in France at the time, not the Lacanian school, right? Who does not really talk in terms of psychological determinism, would not invalidate the outcome of our description. Anguish could be an unknowing ignorance, this is interesting too, of the determinism, in which case it does indeed grasp itself as freedom, or instead one might claim that anguish is a consciousness of not knowing the true causes of our actions. In this case, the source of anguish would be our sense of the monstrous motives. Does everybody have this in the text? You found the passage, or should I go get? Yeah. Did you find it, David? Yeah. Yeah.
What page it is on?
Which page is it in this one?
Oh, and that one, it's on page 72 in the Sarah Richmond. And the other one, let me just get the other one so we're not, I think I have it ready to hand. Let me just see. Yeah. This is the other one. This is what most of you probably have. Yeah. So let me go here too. So this is in the section called The Origin of Negation. And let me just see. Yeah. I mean, this is a rich section. I mean, you're right, David. Maybe we can spend a little time on the origin of negation, right? In a sense. So I'm looking to see what page corresponds. Just give me 1 second. Yeah. Yeah, on page 70 in this text, Josh and others who have the earlier edition, the Hazel Barnes translation. Yeah, it would be in vain to object that the sole condition of this anguish is ignorance, right, of the underlying psychological determinism. She retranslates again. It would be pointless to object, right? Yeah. So anyway. Yeah, so in vain to pointless, right? This is what translators do. Okay, so anyway, this is the section. So I'll just continue to read a little bit, and then David, if you want, you can pose, some questions or whatever. Again, we are essentially, according to Sartre, consciousness is what we are, right? Yeah, what we are. And at the bottom of this consciousness, what we are as human beings, if you will, being thrown into the world, is basically our fundamental being in the world is freedom, right? And for most of the time, we take flight from that, right? We take flight from this because of the anguish and the responsibility that is so deeply embedded in this anguish, where one has to make a choice. One has to make a choice. I can't see my family anymore because they're, mentally unhealthy or toxic to me, even though they're family, right? Where these kind of hard choices, I need to choose a project at a certain time that's going to, take away from other things in my life and become completely fixed on this. And in Sartre's case, people are dead. In Descartes' sense, if you're not thinking, you're dead, right? You don't really exist. Thinking and acting are one and the same. But in Sartrean cases, you're dead without a project, right? This is basically it. You need a project in life, right? Etc. This is what we are. And what this does, in a sense, is the onus, and remember the presupposition here is, of course, God is dead, right? Any notion of transcendence, any notion of immortality, any notion of these things, or immortality can be rewritten as leaving works, right? In a sense. But anyway, all these concepts of the divine and God and 19th century notions, the death of God is come full circle in Sartre, right? Into this position of the atheistic individual and the atheistic humanist moment of that we are thrown into this world. We are, in the Heideggerian sense, and we have no choice but to make ourselves, right? We're not being made by the system, etc. We always have a choice to make ourselves. So to give you examples of this, again, he illustrates and he also in some ways elucidates part of his project, I think very well. One of the great essays is called Tintoretto or The Prisoner of Venice, which I think is one of the great examples of a famous artist who could not get outside the social demands and relations of his time. And ultimately, his art suffered from this. This is a magnificent piece, Tintoretto or The Prisoner of Venice, right, in a sense. He also wrote on Giacometti's uh, uh, um, 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 sculpture as well. Yeah. So this is someone who really saw, in a sense, these limitations of what he would call the no exit, right? The inability of people to take upon themselves their freedom. In some ways, this is one of the reasons he has respect and became a friend of Jean Genet, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Because Genet chose himself being a child of public assistance, right? And Genet identifies himself, I am a thief. I am a homosexual, right? And he lived out that freedom to the limit, right? In some ways. So this is kind of interesting in this regard. This was part of his existential, psychoanalytic model used in art. So anyway, again, the anguish, the deep, deep anguish. For Heidegger, of course, it's angst or anxiety. In Sartre's case, it's really mental anguish, right? It's related to the freedom, right? In a sense. So again, very, very important to keep in mind, right, as we go forward, right, in some ways. This is not about only, if you will, inhibition, symptoms, and anxiety, as Freud would have it, right? This is a deeper existential layer, if you will. It's not a psychological layer only. It's an existential layer. What am I going to do with my very limited time on this planet? What am I going to do with it? And, what is my project? And how do I choose within that project? And how do I choose to make myself? So this is very freeing, but again, it presupposes material conditions that not everybody is obviously in this position. So it's not universal. It is specifically, addressed to a class, right, that is bourgeois in some ways, right, or a kind of working class that is very highly conscious of what's going on, such as the Ronald Aronsons, Franklin Tricchias. I can go through a lot of the names of people that really work themselves out of their class background and into a different level. So anyway, I'd like to hear from you, but I don't know if this helps, David. But any questions about? Yeah.
Yeah, no, this helps a lot. I have two quick things.
Right.
The second thing first, because we'll get back to it. The first thing will be quicker. On page 80, I'll go to it in a moment. He shifts from the definition of anguish to the definition of anguish to the beginning of the definition of bad faith. And he
Right.
starts with what I think is a critique of the psychoanalytic movement that he calls psychological determinism in there
Yes.
that I think is interesting as like again like our kind of framework for then engaging with bad faith and
Yes.
what he's trying to do with it.
That's a
But
code word in this book.
I thought okay, I wasn't
Determinism.
sure about that.
Yeah, it's a code word. Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it just doesn't say the ineptitude and the mediocrity of the French Psychoanalytic Society in 1943.
yeah,
He doesn't put it that way.
he
He's not
says
like
psychological
me, who will
determinism.
name the name and name the people. Anyway, I'm just getting playing. But anyway, he
Yeah,
uses this code, psychological determinism. And
yeah,
this, of course, was also, he was always against this. Remember, too, look, this is a very interesting history. And, B.F. Skinner and Watson, verbal behavior, behaviorism was very dominant, right? That we don't really have a choice. We have no freedom. We don't even have dignity in a sense as human beings. We're conditioned. Walden too was written by Skinner, right? Right. So anyway, there is this attempt to go against behaviorism, right? Also, Marxist reductionism. He couldn't stand the Marxist reductionism to the ideology of economic determinism. He couldn't stand this, right? In a way, because he thought it took away from the possibility of the human in some way, right? Right, in a way. Yeah. It takes away the possibility of those that don't have could go rob a bank or plan a heist, plan a different kind of community, the creation of different kinds so he has arguments about this in a way that, Marxism should never be reduced to just economic determinism, right? This ideology, etc. And by the way, look, for what it's worth, people like Rick Wolf, who a lot of us know or follow and sometimes, have met with, these are people that actually confronted economic determinism and Marxist thinking, right? In a way, yeah. Rick's book, Knowledge in Class, is an attempt to get outside of that ideology of economic determinism. So this is again, Sartre is against this kind of puppetry, right? He's against, again, the transcendental signifier, in a sense that God somehow is the puppeteer or the economy becomes the puppeteer or something like that. He's against this, It's always this cut, this destruction that is going on, right? In many ways. So yeah. Oh, you're smiling, David. Go ahead, please.
no, it's the sentence that I have my eyes on as you're saying this. Just two sentences. The second sentence of the first paragraph of page 80 in his
Okay.
translation.
Okay,
Um,
that would be, let me just see if I can find the corresponding page
I'll
for
start from the
the,
beginning of the paragraph so it's easier to find.
yeah.
It's so the beginning of the paragraph says, however, it would be a mistake to think that all that is needed in order to grasp oneself in a pure state of anguish is to move to the reflective level and consider one's distant or immediate possibles. And this is
Yes,
where it gets really interesting, I think. Every case of reflection gives birth to anguish. So every case of reflection gives birth to anguish as a structure of reflective consciousness insofar as it considers its reflected consciousness. But I can still behave in various ways in relation to my own anguish.
right.
And in particular, there are various ways of fleeing from it. So, like in a minute, bad faith is going to be one of those, right? Like
Absolutely.
a way of fleeing from it. But the next sentence is what I was smiling at. Indeed, everything happens as if one's immediate, or the next two sentences, as if one's immediate and essential response to anguish was to flee from it. Before being a theoretical conception, psychological determinism in, is in the first instance a course of action that aims to excuse, or alternatively, uh, uh, the foundation of every course of action that aims to excuse. In relation to anguish, it's a reflective strategy. It claims that there are antagonistic forces in us whose type of existence is comparable to that of things. It attempts to fill the holes that surround us, to reinstate the ties between past and present, present and future. It endows us with a nature that produces our acts, and it turns those acts themselves into transcendent entities. And he goes on. So this is like his the beginning of how he's going to conceive of bad faith, and also like a real savage attack against what psychological determinism is trying to do to kind of fill in the gap where bad faith should be, I think.
Absolutely. And again, let me just say this too about Sartre. This is about futures. It's not about the past determining things. It's not really even about futures past in some ways, right? It's about future. This is this openness to crafting a completely different future. This is part of its radicality, if you will, part of its contribution, if you will, to the radical imagination, in my opinion. There's not really a root, but there is future, futures, right? In a sense. So you're no longer in the future antérieur, you're just in the future in the Sartrean position here. And that's a very frightening thing, right? Very frightening. And at the same time exhilarating, but at the same time extremely frightening. Yeah, so I think this is important to remember. This ability to take risks, this ability I mean, not just crazy risks, etc., but risks that are part of this anguish and pre-reflective cogito that actually happens, right? Most people just back off. This is also very, very, very interesting to me when you start thinking of Cassirer and Heidegger in 1929 at Davos, that Cassirer will not stare into the abyss. He wants to stay at a more safer level in terms of knowledge, right? Or quintus, right? Whereas Heidegger is going to go down to the Abgrund. I mean, so in different ways. So yeah. So this again is how does one, I guess in a way, since we have a lot of artists here and people that have a lot of openness, how does one get to the point where one can dance over the abyss, right? In a sense, right? How does one, transform that anguish into a dance, into a real freedom going forward? So this is, to me, is part of the Sartrean project, right? In a way. Yeah. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
Just one other quick thing. It's just a very fun example that's been on my mind a couple different times. Um, Life without a project, and the example somewhere in here that he uses of a writer trying to decide whether to write something as like an example of anguish, and like, is this the right time for it? Is there something competing with it? Have I thought it through enough? And all of that. An example of this in a recent book, one of our best science fiction writers, R.F. Kuang, in a book called Catabasis. It's her latest one. It's about it's a science fiction fantasy book. It's hilarious. I think everybody in here would enjoy it. It's about a grad student who goes to hell in order to recover the soul of her advisor because she needs his signature on her dissertation so she can get a good job. So like that's the premise of it.
Right.
And like she goes through the 9 circles of hell, and one of those circles of hell is called the city of Dis.
Right.
And in the city of Dis, you are given an infinite amount of time to write the perfect dissertation. And what happens is the souls who enter the city of Dis, nobody knows if anybody who's written a perfect dissertation has gotten out of the city. But what happens to almost everybody is they get frozen in such a state of anguish for so long that they themselves have become the architecture of the city. So the plants and the bricks in the building and everything all around the city are actually like souls that have just petrified because they're in anguish over writing their dissertation. It's a
That's very
very, very
good.
good. R.F. Kuang's great.
I'm thinking of Catherine Louis' book, the Virtue Hoarders, in this case, and the professional managerial class, how it got that way, and how much in stasis it is, and why academics cannot, take action against, this kind of bureaucratization and administered world under which they all work, in so many ways. This is, terrible. Yeah, in so many senses. So yeah, that's another good point. But again, what you talk about, yeah, 1 second, so and I'll get to you, is Andre Roquentin at the end of Nausea. I must write when the chestnut tree is emptied of all its content. You have to remember the content no longer exists here. Phenomenologically, you're reducing everything, right, to be devoid of content, right? And this is what Sartre is doing. After you empty everything, right? Phenomenologically, what is left for Sartre is freedom, right? That's where we are at the base, right? In a sense, we still have that choice. We've thrown into this. Yeah, Sean, please. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, this is really fascinating, really interesting stuff here. The things that grab me most about this is the issue of bad faith. The thing about bad faith, and one quote, I don't have the page number, but he says, "I must know the truth in order to conceal it from myself." I thought that was a fascinating
yeah,
point.
yes,
And as a way to identify bad faith.
right.
That's a very
Good
interesting
point.
thing to
Yeah,
think about.
he's writing that in relation to the censor too. I know
Yeah,
the truth, but I'm not going to admit it to myself. Right.
right. So the other thing that's fascinating about this discussion and your presentation is this idea of of I think there was an early, I don't have the quote in front of me, but it's the idea that he's arguing against necessity, right? He's arguing against like determinism, but
Yes.
he's not dismissing necessity. It's like he's sort of I wrote it where I wrote it. I said, what is he doing? He's like peering over here. Sartre is peering over the horizon of necessity. It's like we're not there yet. And that's where the anguish comes in. We're
Right.
not there, but he's sort of like peering over what's the possibility of it, right?
Right.
And I think it's almost like he's looking for a way out for that, what you mentioned, the professional managerial class or the academia. They're
Right.
stuck, right? They're stuck.
Totally.
So what is the road for freedom for this class of people, this intelligentsia? So he's sort of like getting them to think about that a little bit. But from my point of view, which I'm not an academic and I don't have any knowledge really of psychotherapy, but for me, the issue of bad faith is very much connected to the political, as you mentioned. It's a very political concept in unions, in mass struggle, in all this kind of thing, because it's very easy for people to jump up and say, so and so is an agent of the bourgeoisie. So and so's this, so and so's that. In other words, you're labeling them as bad faith. It's all
Yes.
bad faith. You don't have to look at anything else.
Right. Exactly. Because you make a very good point there.
Put the
Yeah.
hat on them, they're bad faith.
Right.
Without examining, well, is there more to this than just bad faith? And I think that this is very related to a sort of in a political movement. It's very related to assessing how you make change. Because if you're just like going around labeling people you disagree with as bad faith, that's sort of like a typical sectarian sect kind of approach to transformation. And so I don't know, it just,
Right. And in some ways, you can carry that further. Is signing a petition really good faith? You know what I mean? The some acts that are out there, participating in electoral politics.
performative stuff.
Conscious, yes, yeah, yeah, in some ways. And as you know, I mean, I get probably 20 emails a week to sign some petition, right? So, in a sense, this is the level of the politics, but that is the result. That to me is symptomatic of so much bad faith that is out there instead of the confrontation.
Is it bad faith? In other words, bad faith, he says bad faith is that that you have to know the truth in order to conceal it from myself.
Right.
So are all of these initiatives that I would agree with you. I'd be very, these virtue signaling and all this kind of stuff. I would agree with you that about its ineffectiveness, or it's like, but I wouldn't necessarily label it as bad faith, because
Okay.
I don't know that the truth is known. That's the issue. It's like, well, do they know the truth or do they not know the truth? Yeah, some people obviously know the truth, but most people don't. But they can go along with something. You know what I'm saying? So it's like in a political sense, you don't want to label all these things bad faith, or all the individuals, the
No,
actors,
no, I agree with you
as
there.
bad faith.
Yeah. Okay.
Everybody who voted for Trump, bad faith. Everybody who takes a position that you don't agree with, they're like racist, or they're this, or they're that. You put a hat on everything. And without really, there's definitely people of bad faith,
Mhm.
but you got to be careful politically about who you lump in that crowd.
Yeah, but again, going back to what David is sort of attuned us to and pointed us towards, again, that the bad faith is really a flight from anguish, right? It is the anguish that is being avoided. It is the confrontation with one's self, right? One's mortality, one's project, all of these things that are going on. So this flight from, if you want to say, it's kind of a flight from the anxiety, right? It's a flight from anxiety. It's a flight, as Fromm called it, escape from freedom. I think it's more of a flight from anxiety, and really basically a flight from experiencing the anguish. This is a very deep question, right? In a sense, because it's only in that anguish that you understand. In a way, he's asking the question, "Who am I?" It's a very essential question. Well, there are three questions in Kant, as we know. Who am I? Am I alone? And what am I to do? And then, and of course, then the question of, God and man. But, who am I in a sense? And he's really engaging this kind of question, right? In a way, through anguish. And it's only through this and the development of projects that one really truly becomes human, right? In a sense. Or one is subject to determinism, right? Psychological determinism, advertising signs that con you into thinking you're the one that can do what's never been done. Meantime, life is going on all around you. We stop watching the parking meters. We just go to the spectacle. All of these things are very much part of this flight, if you will, from anguish and the pain of that anguish, right? In many ways, right? So,
I wonder too, Michael, to Sean's point, to connect what Sean's saying to what you're saying a little bit more, that like I wonder how we would approach sort of an analysis within the sort of movement labor spaces that a lot of us are used to of uh, how do I want to say this? Something like a legitimate analysis of somebody speaking from positions of racism or from bad faith, when that analysis like really should hold and that language should be used, because we don't want to walk away from it. And we don't want to walk away from the confrontation that might be necessary. And we need that language for the confrontation, all that. And also, when the use of that language is bad faith and is an escape from the anguish of dealing in more detail with the issues at hand. And in some spaces, it can be, as Sean's saying, a shorthand that actually gets us out of the arguments that need to be had, because we know that if we just use this label, the argument will be short-circuited and we can get out of the so I can see anyway um like the dual use of confrontation with concepts like bad faith and, as Sean cited it, racism or misogyny or things like that in these spaces where on the one hand we absolutely need that language to be in good faith, to have the confrontations that we don't want to have but need to be had. And on the other hand, there are spaces and times where that language is used to escape those confrontations. And so how do we discern between the two of those, I think is a thorny question.
Okay. Yeah, Sean, you want to say some more? Yeah.
Oh, no.
Oh, you had your hand up again. Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, again, you're walking a line there, of course. But again, to me, the bad faith in union struggles is always the drive for security and the inability to take risks, to make and shape something very different. Part of the problem is that, the proletariat as the subject of history is basically mimics the bourgeoisie, wants the same things. Why can't I have that? Right? I want that security. Doesn't really build a culture of its own. That's really been the problem in certain ways. In the 30s, you had working class theater. You had the Henry Street projects and stuff like that. You had music that came out. Look at the good faith between black blues musicians and the Muscle Shoals people. Going up where the white racist class, right, who were musicians who were not white racists, right, such as the Allman Brothers, started to hang with the black musicians, and they built a real movement. Of course, that's shut down because nobody talks about that element. It just becomes part of the spectacle, right, in a sense, right? And so I guess what we're really trying to avoid here is how this becomes, part of the jargon in Sean's language of virtue signaling,
Yeah.
it becomes part of the jargon of the professional managerial, class, how this becomes hoarded, to use, this Marxist term that Catherine Louis has appropriated in terms of virtue signaling and hoarding now. How do we avoid this in the name of looking at this as bad faith and how that plays out? In a way, because it's a deception. Where it's a deception is these things are based on principles, right? Sartre's very well aware of this. What is labor struggle built on? The war against capital, right? Labor against capital, right? The structure. If you're a Marxist, you're thinking overturning of the system, right? You'll settle for nothing less in terms of your fight, right? You don't go around class compromising all the time. You try to think about where are the elements here that actually transform and overturn things. Instead, it becomes almost homogenized in a sense. So I just throwing out those ideas in a sense. Yeah.
If nobody else wants to jump in, I'm thinking too of the use of necessity as a way out of the needed sort of choices or the needed confrontations. The way that, for example, my union, the adjunct union at Rutgers, is led by a leadership group that I had some contact with when they became the leadership group years ago. And when they became a leadership, we were not involved. We didn't have a political culture, and we were not involved in the political culture of New Jersey at all. The plan was, when I was there, that we would build a political culture within the union at Rutgers, which meant like something closer to the CUNY union, sort of open arguments and open ideological arguments, and a much more sort of argumentative meetings and all that kind of stuff. What has happened instead is that the leadership group has become a fundraising arm for progressive Democrats. And the way that they've done this is to, quote unquote, endorse a series of progressives. The endorsements have all been, and this is the bad faith. This is like, I'm getting to this as an example of bad faith. So this is the part where I think like we need bad faith as a concept to make sense of what's happening here, or it's a meaningful concept to make sense of what's happening here. That a group that was talking the talk of social political culture within a labor organization to build a movement from the ground up, ended up doing a series of endorsement votes, all of which were announced on Fridays and closed on Sundays. All of which were announced on Fridays and closed on Sundays, and all of which ended up endorsing the candidates that were being recommended for endorsement, none of which the results were published. So we didn't see the results of any of these, and that's how the endorsements were made. Once the endorsements were made, mass emails were sent out, calls for organizers were sent out, contact lists were then used. So all of the power of the union was then, all the resources were then part of those campaigns. Those candidates did not appear before the union membership. There were no town halls. There was no open debate where like jackass MAGA members of the union could say things and leftists could say things. There was none of that, right? None of that. But they will tell you and swear up and down that this was the necessary way that they had to do things in order to move the political culture of the union forward. And to me, like that, they wouldn't say that's bad faith just because I'm accusing them of bad faith. They would accuse me of bad faith for accusing them of bad faith, and we would go round and round. But it seems very clear that in the Sartrean framework, this is where bad faith is a meaningful concept, because it is impossible to imagine that a group of people who had discussions and know the difference have moved here without consciously inserting necessity as an excuse to avoid the confrontations that they're saying that necessity made them avoid, So it's to me, yeah. Bad faith becomes a very important concept, but it's never going to be a concept that the object of that analysis, or it's rarely going to be an argument that the objects of that analysis are going to agree with and say, thank you for pointing out my bad faith. I am bullshitting myself and everybody. And so thank heavens you've accused me of bad faith.
Listen, just to go back to the union thing, as most of you know, Aronowitz advised against contract unionism. It's better to work without a contract. And in some ways, he was absolutely right. He's very Sartrean in this context, right? Because he already knew all the compromises exactly the way you say to get the contract going forward. And it distracts from the anguish of having to be on your toes all the time, to be able to fight at any minute, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And he really understood this very deeply against contract unionism, right? Number one, right? And then, of course, in terms of, the unions become bureaucratized with grievance and, as you say, party culture, right? Let's meet, greet and meet kind of constitute, and in a way, staying at the contingent. And this is really a question, not so much of a necessity. In Sartrean moment, the line here in the anguish is the contingency. Really, he's talking about contingency. He's talking about the fear of contingency at all moments, right? This is really what it's about, or the anguish before contingency, right? In some ways, which also requires this encounter with nothingness, right? Yeah, that's being denied in these contexts, right? Yeah, yeah, in many, many ways. So this is a very old, this is a battle, if you will. The contingent comes in, against the deterministic, right? Against the already formulaic that you pointed out. We know how sophisticated they are in terms of marketing, getting people out, getting the vote. They're people that spend their whole lives doing this kind of stuff, etc. To my mind, these people are completely in bad faith and have no understanding of contingency and freedom, ultimately. Yeah, because they don't want to go there. They become very formulaic and maybe very intelligent. You'll say, oh, that's a brilliant idea, etc. But at the same time, to me, it doesn't really hold water. It doesn't really move forward. John, you wanted to say some more? Yeah, please. Yeah, yeah.
Uh, yeah, it's just the thing that you said about uh, the fear of insecurity, the fear of the anguish of insecurity, and its connection to contingency, and that sort of this is something to be aspired to, that we want to be in this space of contingency. And that,
Well,
I think
I'm not saying we aspire to it. I just want to be
You
clear
say
about
that's
that.
you're saying
He's
that's
saying that this is the real, right, for him.
well, people want to escape from that because people want some kind of the people want some kind of order. People want some kind of thing that like I know where my next meal is coming from. I know where I'm gonna have a roof over my head. I know if I get sick, I can go to a doctor. I get, medical care. People want to know. People have a desire for order. Maybe people are just like inherently sort of conservative, you know, but the world just keeps turning, twisting that up, and it doesn't allow for that kind of stability or order, right?
Yeah. But
It's
again, the
impossible.
Sartrean notion does not believe in this kind of deterministic kind of approach to human nature, that this is what people want. Again, he is speaking from the position of consciousness, right? He's
Okay,
speaking from this position of consciousness, and he's going through these moments of the pre-reflective, the reflective, and then consciousness and praxis, right? We can maybe go through, layers of this, in a sense. It's pre-reflective, it's reflective, and then there's a praxis to it. And in a sense, he does not believe in so-called human nature, that human nature is this and it's driven by these desires. For him, these are historically generated categories. These are socially generated categories in certain contexts. I guess you could argue, like Marx, in some ways, this is part of uh,
realism.
the conditioning, that's going on, the historical conditioning that shapes nature a certain way. The Leviathan of Hobbes has made us all short, nasty, and brutish, right? In a sense, for 500 years, and here we are. We're all trying to be like Robinson Crusoe, but we forget Friday, right? In a sense, and labor. So I want you to I mean, since we're reading him, to be fair to his thought, in some ways, he's not saying that, again, that there's such a thing as human nature and this is the way it is. He's really talking about our existential condition, if you will, if you want to look at it that way, our existential predicament, if you will, and this experiential level of anguish, which again frees up people. And in a way, for Sartre, it's liberating. Yeah, in a way. Yeah, 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 in a sense. Right? So I always take examples. There's a choice being made. George Jackson makes a choice in prison. Malcolm X makes a choice in prison. Ho Chi Minh makes a choice with General Gia. They're going to fight to the death. They understand this in guerrilla warfare. And I know I'm using, great prime examples of people of great courage and great fortitude and determination. But at the same time, this is where Sartre really wants to go. He's not trying to build this ubermensch such as Malcolm all the time, or as, Che or whatever. He's really just trying to, again, say that, what we forget is that at bottom, we are contingent beings, right, who experience anguish, right, at this moment. But in that anguish, we discover that we're free human beings, right? We're free. We have some kind of, at the base, spontaneously free. You don't have to agree with this, but this is where he's coming from. That's all that I'm just presenting, how he thinks and what he's about here. And this was the existential moment that captured so many people, against the Nazi invasion, against in Vichy, right? Think about it this way too. This is someone that's in a Stalag writing this book, that they're occupied by a foreign country. We have a civil war here. We have a different level, but you have to remember, Europe was occupied, by this monolith, right? In many degrees. And, there were choices that had to be made, right? There was daily anguish, daily confrontation with this. People didn't really care ultimately about, the mortgage payment. I'm not saying this isn't valuable. I mean, I think about this with, certain things I have to do, but this is not, this is the next layer, if you will. These kind of things, when you say order, when you use order as an example, yeah, and in some ways. He's really speaking to our contingency as human beings and to confront that actual contingency. that we're by chance, and this plays out in poetry. Mallarmé, every revolution is a throw of the dice, right? In a sense, taking that chance on a chance, etc. And in a sense, something we've really forgotten, I think, because we're so indoctrinated by strategy, right? Tactics and strategy that we have forgotten what that other layer of this freedom, right? That we do have, or at least according to Sartre, you know? So it's going against here. You can see this. This is against David. I think, one can read into this, an attack on Skinner, of course, and Watson, an attack on Bernays, an attack on Lippmann, an attack on the liberal imagination completely, right? And its sincerity, it's sincere. I go to these stupid union meetings, everybody, thank you, thank you. Thanks for what? It's just some bullshit. This civil society, in a sense, right? In a way. So again, I want to just emphasize again that this is something that we flee from. He's really talking about flight. And we cannot live in good faith all the time. It's an impossibility. He himself, the author of this, didn't live in good faith all the time, no question about it. Yeah, I mean, but at the same time, he is really trying to problematize something that I think is very crucial for our time, since we live in a culture of nothing but bad faith, and that bad faith plays out in spectacles all the time. There's a very interesting connection here, and again, this would be a great thing to connect to is to Society of the Spectacle of Debord, right? In terms of looking at how the spectacle dominates our everyday life so much, right? How it's taken away, yeah, from choice, right, etc. Right? The inverted world that we're living in. How did it get this way? How have we gotten to this insanity when we have a president that says, I love inflation? Can you imagine this? This came out of his mouth today. How do we get to this clown show that we've gotten to without some kind of inversion and some kind of drive? To put it in psychoanalytic terms, what is the drive that did this? But why was this again possible? Right? What were the conditions for the possibility of this massive right turn? It's been going on 50 years. Yeah. What is it about the left in terms of its
War has been peace for decades now.
Yes, of course. No question about that. Yeah, yeah. And we lose all the wars. We don't need to win wars, Bill. You know that, right? So
No,
Iraq
I know
keep
that.
going on
I
another
was
6 months.
I was a direct participant in one.
Yes, exactly. Palantir Technologies, so they can, help themselves. The drone manufacturer, Lockheed Martin, etc. Yeah. So in a lot of ways, I think this is powerful, at least in terms of us trying to understand what was chosen at a certain moment. I used to be really attacked, personally by people I knew. How can you not support Bill Clinton? It's such a change from Bush. And I used to laugh at these people. I said, what are you talking about? Et cetera, right? I mean, it's the one, I mean, these were groups of people that were graduate students, very intelligent, very high-powered readers, et cetera. But going again, the Obama phenomena, right? In a sense, right? That goes on. So how is this consistently brought up by the liberal class, right? And the liberal imagination that begin to distort, right, if you will, because what bad faith does in some ways, if it's consistent, it sets up a culture of distortion. It sets up a culture, to use the right wing term, fake news constantly, right? In some ways. Yeah, because it's not engaging at the roots. Yeah. So it's a little bit of background noise. I don't know where it's coming from, but yeah. Anyway, yeah. So yeah. Anyway, I want to hear more. And this is a very good discussion. I mean, I think this is a very loaded concept. Again, I think that you're right, Sean. The bad faith is not always operative in these struggles. We cannot always be in good faith. But at the same time, what is he really talking about here? Because look, one of the purposes is our reading this, at least in this group of readings in this class, is to look at, Lacan says what psychoanalysis is a science of the unconscious. For Sartre, existential psychoanalysis is a science of choice and freedom. This is the difference, right, in some ways, right? And not that you can't have freedom in psychoanalysis. I'm not saying that. I mean, and anyway, I mean, 1 out of 5 psychoanalyses are successful, if you will. And, again, as I think it was Hans Sachs who said, the cure is never ending. The analysis never ends, right, in a sense. So this is an attempt, if you will, of looking at the structure of consciousness, a science of consciousness, a science of the concrete in consciousness versus that of the science of the unconscious. And I'm not saying one's right or wrong. Please don't hear me that way. I mean, in a way, I think they both have elements that we could really use at this time. Yeah, in many ways. Sartre does not have the emphasis, and I love this about Freud and Lacan, the emphasis upon language, what language is being used, what is the materiality of that language, in a sense, even though he's very well aware of this. He's on top of every movement of his time. Yeah, in a sense. But yeah, so there's something to be said for that. The whole thing of the psychopathology of everyday life, the strategies of narcissism, too. But I told you what he told Pontalis. They asked him, why don't you let me analyze you, right? This is one of his best friends who was a Lacanian psychoanalyst. And he said, no need to, I got everything I wanted. Kind of an interesting response from Sartre himself. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, but to go back to bad faith, again, let me just go to a couple of pages here. And yeah, so he says, very interesting, page 81. Since it is only a postulate or hypothesis, determinism alone cannot be the foundation for this distraction that we have, right? It is a more concrete endeavor at flight, operating within reflection's own domain, right? Okay? It is in the first place an attempt to distract myself from the possibles, and this is again very important, the possibles, right? That are contrary to my possible. Very interesting here, right? When I constitute myself as understanding a possible as my possible, I must of course acknowledge its existence on the other end of my project and grasp it as myself over there, awaiting me in the future and separated from me by a nothingness. In this sense, I apprehend myself as the first origin of my possible. And this is what we ordinarily mean by the consciousness of freedom. I mean, look at yourself, Sean. You chose to go back to school, right? After years to do a master's in liberal arts. You have people that you're very longly associated with who struggled out there, including, and then your own work on, the Harlem Renaissance and communism, if you want to put it that way, and your friend Perry, etc., right? And that goes very deeply. You made that choice, right? In a sense, right? It was a possible for you that you take up in a way, just like anybody else here can make that choice. So anyway, awaiting you in the future. So that future hasn't been fully realized yet, Sean, because you want the book, you want the, the somewhat of the recognition, you continue to do the work, etc., but separated to you by a nothingness. In this sense, as the first origin of my possible. You made the choice. You were the first one in your reflective consciousness to go there. And that is why we ordinarily mean by the consciousness of freedom, right? I am free. I am able to do this. Because most people won't even get out of bed to do this. Yeah. I mean, to say, I can change. I can be, different. I can transform. in a sense. But most people will not have this. It is the structure, it is this structure of consciousness, and in it alone that the advocates of free will have in mind when they talk about the intuition of inner sense. So this becomes philosophical. Remember, this is a philosophical exercise in phenomenological ontology. So he's going to certainly use the intuition of inner sense, right? But it may happen that I try at the same time to distract myself from the constitution of other possibles that contradict my possible. It is true I cannot avoid positing their existence in the same movement that generates the chosen possible as mine. I cannot stop myself from constituting them as living possibles, that is, as possibles that possibility they may become mine, possibly become mine. But I try to see them as if they possessed a transcendent and purely logical being, in short, as if they were things. It is from this standpoint of reflection I consider the possibility of writing this book as my possibility. I conjure up between this possibility and my consciousness a nothingness of being that constitutes it as a possibility, and which I grasp precisely alongside the constant possibility that the possibility of not writing is my possibility. And again, I refer you to the end of Nausea, the last pages, paragraphs of the novel Nausea, right? But I try to behave in relation to this possibility of night reading as if it was an observable object, and I immerse myself in what I wish to see there. I try to view it as something that only needs to be noted in passing and does not concern me. It needs to be an external possibility in relation to me, like movement in relation so that it motionless to that motionless ball. If I manage to do that, the possibles conflicting with my possible, constituted as logical entities, would lose their power. They would no longer threaten me because they would be outside, because they would surround my possible as if they were purely conceivable eventualities, which basically means conceivable by someone else, right? As possible someone else who was in the same situation. And I mean, this is a master psychologist at work if you really begin to think about this. This is really, in my opinion, as a philosopher, yes, he's good, but really as a psychologist, this is first rate, right? He says, okay, very interesting. They belong to the objective situation in the manner of a transcendent structure, or put differently and in Heideggerian terminology, I myself will write this book, but they may also not write it, the dictatorship of the they in Heidegger. By these, and speaking of the dictatorship of the they, so, Sartre is taking a lot from Heidegger here in terms of empty speech, chatter, get ready, idle talk, right, etc. And it leads to the dictatorship of the they self. So again, he's trying to get away from the they self, right? Again, the determination of the they self. So there are many stakes in here for him. Yeah, to preserve the gratuitous character of my possible as the free possibility of a free being, right? But they have been stripped of their menacing character. They're of no interest to me, and the chosen possible appears, owing to its being chosen, as my only concrete possible. In consequence, the nothingness that separates me from the possible, and that precisely bestows its own in its possibility will be filled in. But my flight for anguish is not just an attempt at distraction from the future. It seeks at the same time to disarm the threat posed by the past. What I am trying to flee from here is my transcendence itself, insofar it maintains and surpasses my existence. I claim that I am my essence through the mode of being of the in itself. Right? At the same time, however, I refuse to regard this essence as historically constituted, and therefore as entailing my action to just the way in which a circle entails its properties. I consider it, or at least I try to consider it, as the first beginning of my possible and adamantly deny that it has any beginning in itself. I claim that an act is free, therefore, when it exactly reflects my essence. But in addition, I try to relocate this freedom, which would worry me if it were a freedom confronting myself, inside my essence, inside myself. It is a matter of imagining myself as a small God inhabiting me and possessing my freedom as a metaphysical property. No longer a being that is free insofar, excuse me, as it is. Instead, what is free in the heart of consciousness, my consciousness, is myself. So again, he's constructing here again something very dear to the existential phenomenological movement, existential psychotherapy movement, anti-psychiatry movement, is this return to the self and to the self and freedom, right? And this freedom very much in Anguish. So anyway, he has a long section here philosophically. I think we can go into this. I mean, thank you, David, for this. We can go into Bergson. How there's annihilation. Everybody talks about, like, partially, that there are a lot of arguments in French philosophy, right, amongst each other. There's a lot of interlocutions, and part of this is about Bergsonian intuition, right, where Sartre wants to go further into the future, right? So again, um, um, so yeah, so all this is about the anguish. Just to go forward again. And David, do you have any more to say? I'm really glad you brought this up. I did not plan on going back to the section on negation, but maybe I can put out, the pages we need to read, right, to understand bad faith better.
Yeah,
Right?
that was it. I just thought thinking about anguish and how he connects bad faith to anguish would be helpful. That's all.
Right.
Thank you very much for.
Yeah. No problem. Thank you for pointing this out. Again, for Sartre, listen, just try to keep this in mind. This is a structure of consciousness he is dealing with, in a sense. This is someone that is reflecting upon reflecting upon reflecting in order to get to the reduction of the things themselves to essential, the essence or intuit essences, etc., to move on to the next step. And this is basically the layers that are happening in this structure of consciousness. To think about this as layering might be the best way of looking at it. How many layers of consciousness does bad faith involve, right? What is really happening here, right? So again, and again, the argument, if I can go back to the same text, this is in the next section, pages 91, 92, 93, and in the other edition, the Barnes translation, pages 80, 89, 87, 88, 89, 90, very, very important on lying and bad faith, which he takes up at the end. What I'd like to do, we can go over this obviously more deeply next week. But again, I would like you to retain, if you will, we'll do a phenomenological, retain consciousness, not the moment of unconscious, preconscious, and consciousness, not ego, id, and superego, but think of this in terms of consciousness and the structures of consciousness, right? Because this is what Husserl ultimately was about, and the phenomenological movement about consciousness in this way. Okay, so he's going to, again, go through bad faith. He has many literary examples, some from Proust in terms of jealousy, which nobody's better on jealousy than Marcel Proust, if you've read Remembrance of Things Past, at least in bourgeois culture, discrete terms of the bourgeoisie and their jealousy. And then he has many other examples, but I just want to go, I mean, this is something maybe we can reflect upon. The faith of bad faith, the last section. This is on 113, right? And I think this clarifies a little bit of where we were talking today. This is page 112 in the Barnes, 112, 113 in the newer edition. Okay, so he wants to go, the faith of bad faith. This is section 3 of bad faith, right? But so far we have only pointed out the conditions that make bad faith conceivable. And remember, this is a philosopher at work. He has to create the conditions of possibilities for the concept, right? The structures of being that make it possible to form the concepts that are used by bad faith. We cannot limit ourselves to these considerations because we have not yet distinguished bad faith from lying. The ambiguous concepts that we described could doubtless be put to use by a liar to confound his interlocutor, even through their ambiguity. And this has a very long history going back to liar's paradox, the liar in prison, etc. Yeah, and ambiguity. Being founded in a man's being and not on some empirical circumstance can and ought to be apparent to everyone. Clearly, the real problem of bad faith, and this is again crucial, arises from the fact that bad faith is faith. Right? Right? Very, very good. I mean, he's very, very smart, I promise you. It cannot consist either in a cynical lie or in anything evident, if evidence means the possession of an object in intuition. Yeah? Okay? Evidential, object and intuition, you've intuited the essence. But if we can give the name belief to the union of being with its object, right? Whence the object is either not given or given indistinctly, then bad faith will count as belief. And the problem of bad faith is essentially a problem about belief. And you know the old thing of interpolation, and this goes on the left, especially when I was growing up. You really believe that? You would say to the guy next to you, you really believe this shit? Et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, this is very interesting. How can one believe in bad faith in concepts that have been deliberately forged for the purpose of persuading oneself, giving rhetorical things? We must note, however, that in fact, the project of bad faith must itself be in bad faith. It's not just an opposition to good faith, right? It's interesting. I am not in bad faith only when my endeavor is over, when I've constructed my ambiguous concepts and persuaded myself. And this is the aspect of bad faith as self-deception. To tell the truth, I have not persuaded myself insofar as if I ever could be persuaded. I always have been. And it was necessary at the very moment where I was about to put myself in bad faith for one to be in bad faith in relation to the nation itself, right? Okay? So to represent it to myself in bad faith would have been cynical. To sincerely believe it to be innocent would have been good faith, right? Yeah. So the decision to be in bad faith does not speak its name. It believes, and it does not believe that it is in bad faith. So, a lot of these people, David in the union struggles, et cetera, are basically belief in what they're doing, right? Yeah. It's very interesting there, right? Yeah. And then the Trump people actually, when you listen to Scott Bessent, he really believes his monetary policy. You begin to see this, that the bad faith is really so conditioned, and so much present in the world around this structure of belief. So yeah, it's not opinion, it's belief. It's interesting, right? Yeah. So you have this too, yeah, happening, right? And okay, so the decision to be does not speak its name. It believes, and it does not believe that it's in bad faith. And from the moment that bad faith arises, that decision, right, entirely determines one's subsequent attitude and, in a way, the worldview of bad faith, the Weltanschauung of bad faith. For bad faith does not retain the norms and the criteria of truth that are accepted by the critical thinking of good faith. Effectively and from the outset, bad faith determines the nature of truth. Very interesting here too. Yeah, truth social. You can think of this in terms of truth social right here. Again, a very good dissertation project, right? Truth social as bad faith manifestation in the society of the spectacle. Effectively and from the outside, it determines the nature of truth. Alongside bad faith, a truth appears. That is a method of thinking, a type of being possessed by objects, and the ontological characteristic of this world of bad faith, in which the subject suddenly immerses himself, is that in it being in what it is not, and is not what it is, right? In a sense. So you really become other than you are, right? In a sense, in this bad faith, which is interesting. In consequence, a particular type of evidence appears, non-persuasive evidence. Bad faith apprehends facts that are evident, but is resigned in advance. And I like this too, resigned in advance, not to be fulfilled by such evidence, not to be persuaded and transformed into good faith. The person in bad faith becomes humble and modest. He is aware, he says, that faith is a decision, and that after each intuition, one is obliged to determine what is and to will it. This, in its basic project, and from the moment it arises, bad faith determines the precise nature of its requirement. It becomes visible in the entirety of its resolution, not to ask for too much, to consider itself satisfied when it is poorly persuaded, to force through by means of a decision its adherence to uncertain truth. Thus, primary project of bad faith in a decision is a decision in bad faith about the nature of faith itself. Right? Very interesting. It's understood not as a reflective and voluntary decision, but rather as a spontaneous determination of our being. One puts oneself into bad faith as one goes to sleep, and being in bad faith is like dreaming. Once this mode of being is actualized, it is as difficult to leave it as it is to wake up. And this is the confrontation, again, of anguish, right? Part of the program, if you will, or the project of existential psychotherapy is to make the patient or the patient, the subject, aware of how much bad faith they're in, right? In a sense. And this is agonizing. This is anguish, right? In many ways. And this plays out in many of the organizations from AA to Al-Anon to SA to NA, all these anonymous groups that, based on this structure of denial, etc. But in this case, it's not only denial, it's the structure of bad faith that has to be encountered, right? How this has come to be, how this has become to be believed, right? And in a way. So in a way, and tends to perpetuate that by its own accord, right? It kind of is a self-perpetuating machine, right? It becomes a vicious circle, if you will, again. And even if its structure is metastable in kind. But bad faith is conscious of its structure, and it's taken precautions by deciding that a metastable structure is the structure of being, and that the structure of all our convictions is non-persuasive. Still, if bad faith is faith, and if its own negation forms part of our basic project, I resolve to be poorly convinced in order to convince myself I am what I am not. It must be possible from the outset for there to be a type of faith willing its own lack of conviction. What are the conditions of the possibility? And then he goes on to examples of Peter, Pierre, etc. I just want to jump a little bit. This example is very good. We can return to this next week. I'm sorry again of my own bad faith of wanting to escape into the world of NBA basketball, but I'm doing an escape here and there, I guess, I hope. Okay, there's no cynical lie in bad faith. This is the last page, 117, or any knowing preparation of misleading concepts. Very interesting. No misleading, concepts, preparation of them. But bad faith's most basic act, think about this as a praxis again, is to flee from something it is impossible. That is impossible to flee from what one is. This is very interesting, the power of what one is. This is another way why this is so much of a liberating philosophy. Yeah, because you have you have fled, if you will, you fled from yourself all these years. You're coming back home, if you will, right? Really, in a way, the alienated self, right? the estrangement that one experiences, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the very project of flight reveals to bad faith an internal disintegration in the heart of being, and this disintegration in what it wants to be. In fact, the two immediate attitudes, and again, part of phenomenology is the attitude, one's, I like the word comportment, how one is facing the world, how one behaves towards the world, how one comports oneself toward the world, which goes with it an attitudinal posturing, an attitude of things that can take up in relation to our being are both conditioned by the very nature of our being and its immediate relations with the in itself. Good faith seeks to flee from the internal disintegration of my being in the direction of the in itself that it ought to be and is not. Bad faith seeks to flee from the in itself into the internal disintegration of my being. But it denies the very disintegration just as it denies its own bad faith. In fleeing through not being what one is from the in itself, that I am not in the mode of being what one is not, bad faith, which disavows its own bad faith, aims at the in itself, that I am not in the mode of not being what one is not. If bad faith is possible, this is because it threatens, and this is interesting here, certainly worth thinking about, immediately and permanently every project made by human beings, and because consciousness harbors in its being the permanent risk of bad faith, right? And the source of that risk is that consciousness is what it is not and is not what it is in its being and simultaneously. In the light of these observations, we now will begin our ontological study of consciousness, the being of consciousness itself, not as the totality, right, of human being, but as its instantaneous kernel, right? And this is a kind of, movement away from Heidegger in a sense, instead of the totality involvement. We're going to go to the immediate, instantaneous kernel, right? So very interesting here, again, what bad faith is, what faith is, how one can see this dialectical tension existing all the time. And in a way, this is the question of us becoming and basically undergoing processes that imply freedom, right? And projects, right? Versus that of static goal-seeking organisms, right? In a sense, right? Again, this goal, I have this goal this year. I have this, telos in mind. This is very open-ended in my estimation. Very, very free and open-ended, very free-spirited. So we can go back to this next week if you'd like. I think there's a lot here. Any comments before I close up? Again, I'm sorry. I'm I'm dictogenic tonight in terms of the game. Yeah. Just because I want to see if Mondani went twice this week, and if Trump, yeah. Anyway,
I
at
want to
least
see what the
got
refs
booed.
look like tonight.
What's that? I'm sorry.
I'm curious what the refs look like tonight.
Yeah, it's a good point too. Yes, the refs are going to be playing New York style tonight.
We'll see. Yeah.
They're going to go after this. Yeah, although one can make the argument that Wemby is being protected because he's the future of the NBA, right?
That argument is definitely being made after game 3 for sure.
Absolutely.
It's like one of the discourses, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes. Right. Exactly. Yeah. All right. Good. Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you very much for the participation tonight. This is dense stuff. We'll go back to it, but please retain when you read it, you're dealing with structures of consciousness. You're dealing with what is called a descriptive phenomenology. He is looking at the phenomena of bad faith, right? What is this? And in order to get to the phenomena of bad faith, we have to ask the question, what is faith, right? And be going through those kind of reductions before we get to good and bad faith, which is maybe where he sort of started, but he ends with it, yeah, in a sense. If I were rewriting this, I would begin, let us first distinguish what is faith, right? And then we will look at different aspects of this this is what good faith looks like, this is what bad faith. But this is a more level of abstractions going through these structures and layers of consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It,
yeah, please, Phil. Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I find this description of this phenomenology, much more straightforward than, say, Heidegger's.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, in many ways, but the influence is there. But yes, I agree, of course. Yeah, in a way. Yeah, yeah, very much so. He's doing what he calls a phenomenological ontology. Heidegger is trying to do an interpretive phenomenology through a hermeneutics. Yeah, so there's a different thing. In some ways, Sartre is closer to Husserl than he is to Heidegger in terms of consciousness and intentionality, right? Yeah, yeah. Whereas Heidegger's going his own way. Yeah, in a way. See, there was this question, and I'll just finish on this note. There was this question of how does one translate Dasein into French? And instead of translating it as être là, being there, yeah, it was translated by Sartre as human reality. And this tells you a lot about him, right, in a certain way. The reality of what it means to be human instead of the being there-ness of a. So, of course, this was corrected and created a whole group of professional philosophers, including Jacques Derrida, Jean-Luc Nancy, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, and many others that tried to correct Monsieur Sartre's, misappropriation of the term Dasein, right, being there or there being. So you raise a good point. I think Sartre is much more concrete. He is a philosopher of concrete relations in some ways, even though there are many levels, obviously, here of the movement from the abstract back to the concrete. But that's dialectical thinking. You don't begin with the concrete that David Winters exists. You have to deal with the abstraction first in terms of how do you get back to the concretization? What is it that makes that existence, etc. So very, very important. Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right. So everybody, at least the Yankees won today, Sean. Yeah, yeah. Right. So we'll see tonight. Yeah.
Well, the
Okay.
Mets are getting destroyed right now.
What's that? Sorry?
The Mets are getting killed right now.
Oh yeah, well that goes without saying.
They're
That's almost,
terrible. Or
that's almost deterministic at this point.
it's Steve
And the
Cohen's
Red Sox
racketeering
too,
scheme
unfortunately.
called the Mets.
Yeah, the Red Sox too, in an unfortunate way. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, good.
Thanks so much, Michael.
Everybody, I'll see you next week, and we'll go longer next week. Okay, okay. Thanks so much. Okay, bye-bye. Yeah. Thank you, Ezra. Yeah. Have a good night, everybody.